Hi. So last week and in one of the other PowerPoints for this week, we've been talking about different ways that the Constitution has been interpreted to protect pure speech for the most part, and also to protect symbolic speech, even though symbolic speech isn't specifically mentioned in the Constitution. It is a form of expression that the Constitution also protects. What I want to talk about in this PowerPoint is the concept of what are called time, place, and manner restrictions. Essentially, what this means is that even if the government, even if it would be unconstitutional for the government to prohibit speech or to punish speech, it is sometimes legitimate and not a violation of the First Amendment for the government to place time, place, and manner restrictions on how speech is done. So just as it says, so for example, even though you have the right to free speech, you don't have the right to exercise your right to free speech at 2 o'clock in the morning in a residential neighborhood by shouting through a bullhorn, right? There would be a time restriction on that. Similarly, lots of governments require people to get permits before they can have large gatherings in parks, for example. The park is a public place and you can go there, but if you're going to use it for a big demonstration where there's going to be amplified music or lots of speeches being made, you might have to get a permit. They might want you to provide some security. They might want you to put some porta potties out. So if the crowd is large enough, they might have that as a restriction. They may not want more than one group using the park at any given time. And so they might place a restriction on how many people can get permits to hold large events in parks. So time, place, and manner restrictions. And what I want to talk about is sort of how this has played out in the courts, in terms of the courts trying to figure out a way, when is it okay for the government to put time, place, and manner restrictions on speech, and when would the government be actually violating the First Amendment when it came to time, place, and manner restrictions. So there's three things that you should keep in mind with regard to time, place, and manner restrictions. The first goes back to a concept that we've talked about before, and that's the issue of content neutrality. When the government places a restriction on speech, it's not allowed to place the restriction as a way of preventing the content of the speech from being made. So if the government is going to place a time, place, and manner, or TPM, on a particular exercise of free speech, the reason for the restriction has to be unrelated to the content of the speech. So for example, if the city of Sacramento decided they were going to require people to get a permit to hold gatherings of larger than 100 in the park across from City Hall, it would be unconstitutional for them to say, we'll require a permit for anybody who wants to speak out against a city policy. But if you want to speak in behalf of a city policy, you don't have to get a permit, right? Because that policy would then not be content neutral. It would be based on what it is you want to say. And the court takes a very dim view of that. The second thing to keep in mind about time, place, and manner restrictions is that they have to be reasonable, right? The government has to interfere with free speech as little as possible. They're supposed to leave avenues open for the exercise of speech and only put restrictions on that are reasonable, that could be easily met, that aren't overly burdensome on speech. And so the expectation is that time, place, and manner restrictions would be reasonable. So I want to talk a little bit about how this issue has come before the court in the last few years. So these are the types of protests you might see in America: pro-life, pro-choice. Sometimes these demonstrations have lots and lots of people at them. There have been lots of anti-gun, gun control, Black Lives Matter marches. So a lot of times time, place, and manner restrictions are geared toward keeping protests peaceful and making sure that they don't block traffic during rush hour and that kind of stuff. And so we see a lot of these kinds of restrictions come up with regard to group speech, in essence, or freedom of assembly. And I want to give you some examples of how the court has applied this content neutral and reasonableness standard on time, place, and manner restrictions. So if we talk about what are called public fora, or if something is a public forum, it's a place where you would normally expect free speech to take place. Sidewalks, parks, places where people might gather that are public, that are owned by the government, where people might exercise their rights to free speech. So I just want to give you 3 examples of cases where the court has been asked whether or not a time, place, and manner restriction violates the First Amendment or not. The first is an example of a time, place, and manner restriction that was accepted by the court as reasonable and as content neutral, etc. So the city of, or the federal government there's a park across from the White House in Washington, D.C. It's called Lafayette Park, and lots of people go there on a regular basis, but that's also a good place to protest if you want to be protesting within sight of the White House. So this organization called the Community for Creative Nonviolence wanted to have a protest at the park to protest against, in favor of policies to help the homeless. They wanted to bring attention to the plight of the homeless, and their plan was to essentially camp out in the park. They got a permit to be there, but they wanted to be there overnight. They wanted to pitch tents. They wanted to sleep in the park. But the park had a policy that applied to everybody that said the park closes at, I think it's dusk, or closes at night, and you're not allowed to stay in the park overnight. The Community for Creative Nonviolence argued that they should be given an exception, essentially, because theirs was a political protest. And the argument that they made was that the park, the director of the park program was just trying to keep them out of the park because they didn't like the message. But the Supreme Court upheld the time, place, and manner restriction in this case. They said the Community for Creative Nonviolence was not being singled out. Everybody was being told that they couldn't camp in the park. And the court accepted the government's argument that they had legitimate reasons for closing down the park at night. They wanted to keep drug deals out. They wanted to make sure that people were safe, etc. So this was an example of a time, place, and manner restriction that the court found was reasonable and was content neutral. It allowed the Community for Creative Nonviolence other opportunities to protest. They could stay there all day. They could come back in the morning. They could stage a fake sleepover where they pretended to sleep during the day. There were lots of things that they could do, and so the court found this to be reasonable. I'll give you an example of a policy that the court found partially reasonable, and partially not reasonable. And this is a case that came before the court in 1997 called Schenck versus Pro-Choice Network of Western New York. And the city at issue had a policy on the books that is not uncommon. Lots of cities have this kind of ordinance on the books that's designed to ensure that people who are trying to access clinics where abortions are performed can get to the clinic and get the medical care that they're seeking without being hindered by anti-abortion protesters. So the policy in place required a couple of things. One, it said that the pro-life, or any demonstrators, but there's not usually a lot of pro-choice demonstrators at places like Planned Parenthood, etc. It said that the protesters were not allowed to block the entrances and exits to and from the building, and they weren't allowed to block the sidewalk and prohibit people from going into and out of the building. They could protest, but there were some restrictions. They also said that the protesters had to stay 15 feet away from the entrance and 15 feet away from anyone who was approaching the building. So they called those buffer zones. One was fixed. You have to stay 15 feet away from any entrance or exit. And I believe it applied also to the parking lot, getting into the parking lot. And then there was a floating buffer zone that moved with the people trying to get into the building. The pro-life protesters, which represented by Schenck, were well, they objected to all of these restrictions, but in particular, they argued that if they were made to stay 15 feet away from the people, it would interfere with their message, because a floating buffer zone would mean that they wouldn't be able to protest until they had measured how far away they were to somebody trying to get into the building. And the fixed buffer zone, the argument was very easy to establish. The Supreme Court split the difference. They upheld the fixed buffer zone as a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. They said 15 feet for anybody who doesn't have the softest of voices. Anybody can get their message across from 15 feet away. And if they wanted to provide people with materials, written materials, it would be very easy for the person to see that they had some materials on offer. And if they wanted to go and take the material, they could go and take the material. They said that doesn't hinder free speech in a way that would violate the First Amendment. And right, we've got competing rights here. We've got the right of free speech versus the right of people to access the clinic for medical services that are protected by the Constitution. They struck down the floating buffer zone. They said this actually is an unreasonable restriction on free speech because the speaker would have to be constantly monitoring how far they were away from anybody trying to get into the facility. And they said that actually is too much of a burden. So they struck down the floating buffer zone. One of the most recent cases, time goes by so fast, this is actually, it seems like it was just yesterday that this case came before the court, but it was actually almost 10 years ago. This is a case called Snyder versus Phelps, and this is an example of where the court just completely struck down a policy as being an unreasonable and not a content neutral time, place, and manner restriction. This case involved the Snyder family whose son was killed overseas in a military action against the Reverend Fred Phelps, who he's dead now, but at the time he was the leader of a very small but very conservative and virulently anti-gay rights church. And what Phelps and his followers did, and they still do even though Phelps is dead, is they would picket the funerals of military men and women who had died in combat. And some of the signs they held up and some of the speeches that they made were patently offensive to the families and offensive to people who support gay rights. They would say things like, God hates gay people, and that the United States was going to be punished for the sin of supporting gay rights. And the Snyder family sued Phelps for inflicting emotional distress. And they asked, and so what happened at this demonstration, the government had a policy in place that prohibited people from picketing the military funerals and from being within a certain number of feet from the cemetery. And Phelps argued that this was not content neutral, that he was being singled out because of the message, because of the content of his protest, that if people had wanted to go there to support the soldiers, they wouldn't have been told that they couldn't be there, but people were told that they couldn't protest at these funerals. And so this case made its way through the courts, and in 2011 the Supreme Court struck that policy down, and they essentially argued that it was not a reasonable content neutral time, place, and manner restriction. And so just to show you that the Supreme Court isn't always the last word on this, what's happened since then is whenever Phelps's organization announces, they always announce that they're going to picket a funeral so that they can get some media attention. Whenever they make an announcement, people who are supportive of the soldiers and who are supportive of gay rights counter mobilize and show up en masse to sort of drown out any message that the Phelps organization might want to put out. And a lot of times that when that happens, the protest doesn't happen at all. So those are time, place, and manner restrictions in traditional public places. The other area that I wanted to share some cases with you and talk to you a little bit is how the court allows the government to regulate speech in non-traditional places, non-traditional fora, which is the plural of forum. And so one example of that would be the TV and radio airwaves. Of course, in 1787, when the Constitution was written, and in 1791, when the First Amendment was adopted, there were no radio or TV airwaves, and yet that's where a lot of speech takes place. And for the most part, the government doesn't engage in censorship. They don't prohibit people from airing whatever type of programming they want to air. But they do place time, place, and manner restrictions on some of the language that's used in some of these shows. And generally speaking, the purpose of these time, place, and manner restrictions is to make it easier for parents to keep their kids from hearing language or from seeing, say, sexually explicit material at times when children are usually watching television. So this doesn't really apply to cable, because if you subscribe to cable, you're paying for the programming, but for broadcast media on Channel 3 or Channel 10 or Channel 13, and on radio stations like KNBR or something that's not part of Sirius XM or something like that, these time, place, and manner restrictions are put in place by the Federal Communication Commission. And every once in a while, there'll be a case that comes before the court. But the main case that established the power of the government to place these time, place, and manner restrictions on radio and TV, broadcast radio and TV, is a case called FCC versus Pacifica Foundation that was decided in 1978. Now, most of you are too young to have heard George Carlin as a stand-up comic, but he was the source of this court case. So George Carlin is dead now, but he was a comic, and one of the routines that he was most famous for was a routine about the 7 words you're not allowed to say on the radio or on television. And those 7 words are very bad words that you would be taught are bad words, and it includes the F word and a bunch of other words, usually dealing with having sex or going to the bathroom. Those are the kinds of words that the government often finds obscene or offensive. And so the policy at the time was you can't say, and still for radio stations that are broadcast over the radio waves, the airwaves, is that you can't air those words during times when children are likely to be listening. So it's like before 9 o'clock at night. And I think it's like 6 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock at night or something like that, where kids might be reasonably expected to be listening or watching. And so the radio station played this routine along with all the words that you're not allowed to say without bleeping them out, and got in trouble because parents who were, driving their kids home from school or whatever, listening to this radio station, and all of a sudden there's all these expletives being said in front of their kids. So the Pacifica Foundation, which was defending Carlin and the radio station, came up against the Federal Communications Commission, and this policy was challenged as a free speech question. But in 1978, the Supreme Court upheld those restrictions, and so to this day, there is a list of words that have to be bleeped out of broadcast media. And so, like a lot of radio stations, especially ones that have call-in programs, they actually delay for a few seconds the broadcast so they can beep out any words that people say that they weren't supposed to say. So the court found that that was a reasonable restriction because the technology is there to bleep the words out, and you can still get your message across without using that kind of language. I'll give you an example of a restriction that the court said was not reasonable with regard to trying to keep things out of children's little young eyes. This is a case called U.S. versus Playboy Entertainment Group, and this case comes from 1999, and the technology for cable television and for internet streaming television and stuff has come a long way since 1999. But at the time, most of you probably don't remember this either. At the time, when a person would flip through the channels on their television, if they got to a channel that they didn't subscribe to, instead of just skipping that channel and going to the next channel that they were subscribed to, you'd get a phenomenon that was known as signal bleed, where just for a brief little nanosecond, you would see what was happening on the channel that you weren't allowed to see. And so the federal government put a policy in place that said all adult programming that would not be suitable for children, must be either 100% blocked from anybody who doesn't subscribe to that channel, or only shown after, I think it's 9 o'clock at night, where it could reasonably be expected that young children would be in bed. So the Playboy Entertainment Group, which has television stations and internet streaming stations that provide adult entertainment, it's not made for children, it's entertainment made for adults, they sued because they argued that, not that it wasn't a content neutral restriction, they argued that it wasn't a reasonable restriction because at the time in 1999, there wasn't any way to block the signal bleed. So what Playboy Entertainment Group was arguing is, you are effectively telling us we can't show our channel during the day to people who have paid for the subscription because we can't block it 100% from children. And so by telling us that we have to block the signal, you're putting an unreasonable restriction on us because we can't. The technology doesn't exist for us to be able to do that. And the Supreme Court struck that part of the policy down. They said, yeah, you can't put a restriction on people that they can't meet, right? And so that's some examples from radio and television. More recently, what's come before the court have been some really interesting cases involving restrictions on what you can wear when you go to vote or if you work at a polling place, and the government's policies regarding who can get a trademark for a name or a picture or something like that? And under what conditions can the government deny somebody a trademark? That is, the government protecting that from competition. So these are all three examples that I'm going to give you are examples that show that as the court has dealt with more and more of these issues, it's become pretty clear that the court is very, very suspicious of government attempts to regulate sort of the morality of speech or the offensiveness of speech, etc. And laws that have even been on the books for a long time are starting to be challenged. And the court, in these three examples that I'm going to give you, has sort of been sending a message that they're going to be very stingy about allowing the government to interfere in political speech in particular, but even commercial speech, which does not have the same level of protection as political speech. So our example from Polling Places was just decided a couple of years ago, the Minnesota Voters Alliance versus Mansky. So just to set this up, most states have a policy in place that regulate what's called electioneering, or well, they call it electioneering, within a certain number of feet of a polling place or within a polling place. And that usually includes a prohibition on wearing, like say, wearing a t-shirt that supports a candidate specifically, or that would say vote no on a proposition that's on the ballot, or vote yes on a proposition that's on the ballot. Language that would be a reasonable person would recognize very quickly as supporting one particular person or issue that's on the ballot, right? So if I go to vote in person and I want to wear a t-shirt supporting the candidate that I support for president, under California law, I would have to take that t-shirt off and wear something else to the polling place, because that's considered electioneering. What was at issue in this court case was Minnesota's law, which was much broader than that. The Minnesota law basically prohibited any kind of messaging that might be seen as overtly political, not necessarily aimed at a candidate or something that was on the ballot, but just sort of generally political. But it didn't really define exactly what that meant. And so Mansky and the organization that he was a part of, which included a lot of, at the time, Tea Party organizations and sort of libertarian-leaning kinds of groups, that they wanted to challenge this policy as being sort of overly broad and a violation of people's free speech. So Mansky wore a t-shirt, but also a button that was sort of like this. It says, "Please ID me," and it's obviously sending the message that that this group wants stricter voter identification laws, etc. He was told that he would not be allowed to vote unless he took the button off, unless he took his t-shirt off. And so he filed a lawsuit and challenged the law, and this issue came before the court in 2018. And in this case, the court said states can put reasonable restrictions on electioneering. So California's law is fine because it's very specific in terms of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do within, I think it's 100 feet of a polling place. But they struck down the Minnesota law. They said it is so vague that it's a speaker, a person wearing their clothing or whatever, couldn't be expected to know what was allowed and what was not allowed. And even the people at the polling place weren't entirely certain what they were supposed to allow and what they were not supposed to allow. And so it becomes then an unreasonable restriction that's not really workable. And it opens it up to a lot of bias, right? So somebody might allow t-shirts that support a cause that they agree with, that's not on the ballot, but is something they agree with, and then tell somebody that they have to take off the clothing that promotes an issue that they find offensive. So that's the most recent case having to do with polling places. And that where the court struck down the policy. And then these last two cases, I'll give them both to you, and then we'll talk about them. There's a law on the books. It's called the Lanham Act, Lanham, and it essentially regulates how the government gives out trademarks when a company or a person or a group come to the government and they want to trademark the name of their company or whatever so that other people can't use it. So if, Starbucks is Starbucks, they have the trademark to Starbucks, and another coffee place can't just open up and call themselves Starbucks. But this Lanham Act put some it used to put some restrictions on what kinds of things you could trademark. So one of the things that the Lanham Act prohibited was, it said that the government could reject a trademark request if that trademark included language that was disparaging of others on the basis of race or whatever, that the trademark could be denied. And then the other part of the Lanham Act allowed the government to deny trademarks that the government deemed immoral or scandalous. And so cases from 2017 and then just from last year, cases came before the court challenging on First Amendment grounds those policies. And in both cases, the Supreme Court struck the policy down and sided with the group's First Amendment free speech protection. Mattal versus Tam involves this group. It's a band, a rock band called the Slants. Slants is a racially derogatory name for people of Asian descent. The Slants are obviously Asian, and they wanted to reclaim that name. They wanted to reclaim that name and make it their own, to take the sting out of that racial epithet. The Supreme Court, the trademark office said, we won't allow you to trademark a racial slur, and the Supreme Court sided with the band. And they said, that's not something that the trademark office gets to pick and choose. And so they allowed the Slants to have their name trademarked. Iancu versus Brunetti involves a company called FUCT, owned by a guy named Eric Brunetti. It's a clothing company, and he went to the trademark office to trademark his name and his logo, this logo of his company, and he was turned down because the person responsible for reviewing his application found that it violated the Lanham Act, that it was immoral or scandalous in its language. And so Brunetti challenged that. It went to the Supreme Court, and last year the Supreme Court struck that part of the Lanham Act down. They said, we're not the arbiters of morality and what kind of language somebody can use in the name of their company. Our job is to make sure that companies aren't using each other's names in unfair competition or in ways that could confuse consumers, etc. But we're not the police. We're not the morality police. I don't think they used the term morality police, but they did strike those policies down. So reasonable restrictions on the time, place, and manner of speech, and content neutral restrictions are allowed. But as we can see, the Supreme Court takes its role protecting the First Amendment very seriously. And in recent years, within the last, say, 5-10 years, the court has been very hesitant to allow these kinds of restrictions on free speech.